The blood hit the floor before the gurney cleared the ambulance bay doors. A four-star general was screaming, actually screaming, in the middle of a trauma corridor, demanding the best surgeon in the state while his son's chest caved inward with every labored breath. Monitors shrieked, staff scattered, and then she walked through the doors. A quiet blonde nurse in faded scrubs, no title on her badge that meant anything to anyone in that room. She moved to the bed without being asked. She started giving orders without raising her voice. The general turned, and every drop of color left his face. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one don't slow down and they don't repeat themselves. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The shift had already been bad before the call came in. Mercy Crest Regional Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Dunmore, Wyoming, a mid-sized city that had grown faster than its infrastructure over the past decade and hadn't quite caught up yet. The trauma wing was understaffed on a Tuesday night in late October, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the fog, thick and low, the kind that pressed against the windows and muffled the sound of sirens until they were almost on top of you. Cassandra Holt had been a trauma nurse for 11 years. Before that, she'd been a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Support Battalion, which was not something she put on her Mercy Crest ID badge or brought up in staff meetings or mentioned when administrators walked the floor looking for photo opportunities. She kept that part of herself in a separate drawer, metaphorically speaking, locked, filed away. She was 41 years old, medium height, blonde hair pulled back in a bun that had mostly given up on itself by hour 7 of her shift. She had a small scar at the corner of her left eyebrow from a piece of shrapnel she'd never told the complete story about. Her handwriting was terrible. She kept a protein bar in her left scrub pocket and forgot to eat it most nights. She was, in the estimation of her supervisor, Karen Mott, competent but difficult to manage, which was supervisor language for she doesn't defer to people she doesn't respect, and that makes certain people uncomfortable. Cassandra was updating a chart at the nurses' station when the radio call came through. Military transport, inbound, critical trauma. ETA, 6 minutes. She looked up. The charge nurse on duty, a man named Garrett Finch, was already on the phone with someone, hand raised in a gesture that meant he was aware and handling it. The two residents on shift, both of them first year, both of them visibly exhausted, were looking at each other in the way young doctors looked at each other when something was escalating beyond their training. "What's the injury?" Cassandra asked, leaning toward the radio desk. The medic on the other end crackled through static. "GSW to the upper chest, possible cardiac involvement. Patient is Captain Marcus Hale, Special Forces, 29 years old. We're losing pressure." Cassandra was already moving. She pulled a trauma cart from the supply alcove without waiting to be asked, checked the defibrillator leads, verified the chest tube kit, confirmed 2 large-bore IVs were staged and ready. It was the kind of preparation that happened in the hands before it happened in the head. 11 years of the same movements, layered over 6 years of military muscle memory underneath that. Garrett caught her. "I've got this, Holt." "I know you do," she said. "I'm just prepping. Dr. Faraday is being paged. Dr. Faraday is across town at Clearfield General finishing a consult. That's 40 minutes in this fog." She didn't say it unkindly. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Garrett's jaw tightened. He was 34, newer to the trauma floor than she was by 5 years, and had a hospital administration certificate framed on the wall of his office. He and Cassandra had a professional relationship that was functional in the way a slightly misaligned door is functional. It opens, it closes, you just have to push a little harder than you should. "We have Dr. Nolan," Garrett said. "Nolan's a second-year surgical resident." She picked up a sterile drape. "I'm not saying don't page Faraday. I'm saying don't wait for him." Garrett stared at her for a moment, then turned back to his phone call. The ambulance bay doors blew open 4 minutes later, not 6. 2 paramedics came through fast, the gurney between them moving at a pace that told Cassandra everything she needed to know before she could see the patient. When she did see him, her assessment took less than 3 seconds. Young, male, high athletic build reduced by blood loss, uniform jacket cut away, pressure dressing on the left upper chest, soaked through, Skin gray-white, lips slightly blue. His eyes were open. That was the thing about soldiers. They kept their eyes open longer than they should, as if staying conscious was a matter of discipline. "What do we have?" she said to the lead paramedic. Not a question, moving alongside the gurney. GSW, left thorax, entry wound subclavian region, exit wound unclear. En route, BP dropped from 90/60 to 70/50, heart rate 140 and climbing. He coded briefly. We got him back. 2 liters saline on board, not holding. Tension pneumo, bilateral breath sounds on arrival, decreased left. She was already at the head of the bed as they moved him into Trauma Bay 1. The resident, Dr. Nolan, appeared at the foot of the gurney with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed. "I'll take it," Nolan said. "Start the secondary survey," Cassandra told him, which was not disagreement exactly. It was direction. "I need a portable chest x-ray in here, and a fast exam, now." She pressed 2 fingers below the clavicle, feeling the resistance in the chest wall, the subtle tracheal shift that the x-ray was going to confirm in about 90 seconds. She'd felt it before. She knew what it meant. The doors at the far end of the corridor banged open, and the room changed. Not in a subtle way, not the way the atmosphere shifts when someone important enters. It happened faster than that. More like the way a room changes when someone brings a fire inside. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from decades of physical discipline rather than vanity. His uniform was decorated in the restrained, specific way of senior Army brass, 4 stars on his collar, his chest a geography of ribbons and commendations. His face was 60-something and looked like it had absorbed a great deal of weather and said very little about it. His eyes were pale gray and were currently fixed on the gurney with an expression that Cassandra could only describe as controlled terror. Behind him came 2 aides and a woman in civilian clothes who appeared to be some kind of attaché. "That's my son," the general said. His voice was deep and flat and didn't rise at the end. He walked directly to the bedside without stopping or asking permission. "Who's in charge here?" Garrett materialized from somewhere near the door. "General Hale, I'm Garrett Finch, charge nurse. I didn't ask for a charge nurse." General Bowen Hale looked past Garrett as if he simply wasn't there. His gaze moved across the room, cataloging, assessing. "Where's the surgeon?" "Dr. Faraday is being paged, sir. He's the head of our trauma surgery department, and he's—" "How far away?" Garrett hesitated. "Approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The general's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He turned back to his son. "Marcus." He said the name once, quietly. The young captain's eyes moved toward the voice, but didn't quite focus. "I'm here." Cassandra had not stopped working. She was hanging a second IV line, eyes on the monitor, running the numbers. 71/47, heart rate 146. The chest x-ray came back and she snapped it onto the light board in 3 seconds flat. Hemothorax, left side. Substantial. And something else. She looked at the image. Looked at it again. The bullet had not done what bullets usually did. The trajectory was wrong. Instead of clean lung damage, the lead had fragmented and one piece, small, irregular, had traveled medially, toward the heart, not touching it yet, but close enough to compress the pericardial space. Cardiac tamponade in progress. She said it aloud, to Nolan, to the room. "He's got tamponade developing. We need a pericardiocentesis now, and we need to get a thoracic surgeon on the phone." Dr. Nolan looked at the x-ray. Looked at her. Looked back at the x-ray. Garrett's voice came from behind her. "Cassandra, he's got maybe 20 minutes before his heart can't push against the pressure," she said, already moving to the procedure kit. "Nolan, tell me you've done a pericardiocentesis." The resident's silence was its own answer. "I'll walk you through it," she said. "You'll walk him through it." Garrett's voice had acquired a specific texture, the one that preceded an authority conversation. "You're a nurse, Cassandra." "I'm aware of what I am." "That procedure requires a physician." "Nolan is a physician." She looked at the resident. "We need a long gauge needle, subxiphoid approach, ultrasound guidance. Can you do this?" Nolan was staring at the monitor. The heart rate had jumped to 153.
Yes, with guidance. Then let's set up. Stop. The word came from General Hale. He had moved to the other side of the gurney without anyone noticing, and he was looking directly at Cassandra now, not at the chart, not at the monitor, not at the X-ray. At her. Something happened behind his eyes. Not recognition exactly, more like the leading edge of it, the moment before the mind catches up to what the body already knows. "What's your name?" he said. "Holt," she said, not looking up from the procedure tray. "Cassandra Holt." She did look up then, briefly, long enough to confirm the direction of his attention. "Yes," she said. The general was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. "Get away from my son," he said. Garrett moved toward her, Tess. "Cassandra, let's step out. There's no time to step out." She turned back to Nolan. "Subxiphoid, 15-degree angle toward the left shoulder. I'm going to guide your hand on the ultrasound." "I said step away." The general's voice was different now, not louder, the opposite. It had dropped into a register that people with his rank used when they meant the most. "I know who you are, I know what you did, and I will have you removed from this room and this hospital before you put your hands on my son." The room had gone very still. The 2 residents, the nurses, Garrett, who was now caught between 2 conflicting professional obligations and visibly showing it. Even the monitors seemed to pause, though they didn't. Cassandra straightened. She looked at General Bowen Hale across the width of the gurney, across the body of his son, across whatever it was that lay between them. She knew what it was, had been carrying the weight of it for years, and she did not look away from him. "Sir," she said, "I understand you have a history with my name. I understand that right now that history feels like a reason, but I need you to look at that monitor." He didn't. "His systolic is 68, she said. "His pericardium is filling with blood. When it reaches the point where his heart can't expand, it will stop. That will happen in—" She glanced at the clock. 15 to 18 minutes based on current trajectory. Dr. Faraday is 40 minutes away. Dr. Nolan can perform this procedure with my assistance right now, or you can wait for a surgeon and watch your son die in this room while you're looking at me." She said it clearly and without cruelty, just the way she said most things, the way they needed to be said. General Hale's jaw was iron. His eyes had not moved from her face. There was something happening behind them that she recognized because she'd seen it once before, in a different country, in a different decade, in a situation she was not going to think about right now. He was weighing the thing he believed against the thing in front of him. "He gets the surgeon," Hale said. "I agree," Cassandra said. "And until that surgeon arrives, your son gets me." "You're a nurse." "Yes," she said. "I am." Garrett touched her arm. "Cassandra, I need to ask you to Garrett." She turned to look at him, and her voice was still steady, still even, still completely without drama. "If you pull me from this room right now, you will have made a choice about this patient that you will have to live with. I'm not being insubordinate. I'm telling you the situation. Make your call." Garrett's hand dropped. He stepped back. She turned back to Nolan. "Let's go." The pericardiocentesis took 11 minutes. Cassandra guided Nolan's hand on the ultrasound probe, talked him through the needle angle, watched the fluid pull into the syringe, dark, not arterial, which was what she'd hoped, and monitored the pressure readings on the monitor as the tamponade began to release. 72 over 50, 78 over 54, 81 over 57. The heart rate came down from 153 to 138, then 124. Captain Marcus Hale's lips were still pale, but they were no longer blue. His eyes closed, which was actually better. The forced alertness had been the body spending reserves it didn't have. His chest rose and fell with more room in it. Cassandra stripped off her gloves. She updated the chart without looking at the general. She could feel him behind her. She'd felt him the entire time. That particular weight of someone watching you with complicated intention. But she had 43 minutes of training built on top of 6 years of military discipline, built on top of 11 years of trauma nursing, and none of those layers left room for the thing he was waiting for her to feel. "He's stable," she told Nolan. "Temporarily. The underlying hemorrhage is still there, and he needs the surgeon, so make sure the OR is prepped and that Faraday has an updated vitals picture."
Nolan was staring at his own hand slightly. "Hey," she said quietly. "You did well." The resident looked up, nodded once, moved. "Holt." She turned. General Hale was still at the bedside. His hand was on his son's forearm, the lightest possible contact, the way a man touches something he is afraid to hold too tightly. He was looking at her with the same complicated intention, but the nature of it had shifted. Not gone. Shifted. "I want to talk to you," he said. "I need to finish this patient's documentation," she said. "After." She looked at him. At the granite of his face, the controlled grief in it, the thing he'd been carrying that was different from the grief. Older, harder, sitting underneath. "After," she agreed. She walked to the nurse's station and sat down and began typing. Her hands were completely steady. Outside the trauma bay window, she could hear the sound of the fog pressing against the glass and the distant signature of a siren. And in the break room down the hall, a television. No one had turned off, was cycling through late news, nobody was watching. Garrett appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision. "You understand there's going to be a conversation about this," he said. "I expect so," she said, not pausing her typing. "You performed." "I guided a licensed physician through a life-saving procedure. That is within my scope of practice in an emergency situation with no supervising surgeon present. That's..." Garrett stopped, recalibrated. "Administration is going to have a different interpretation." "They usually do," she said. He stood there a moment longer. She could hear him breathing. He wanted to say something else and couldn't find the specific thing that would land, so eventually he walked away. Cassandra finished the documentation. She pulled the protein bar from her left pocket and ate exactly half of it, which was her personal record. She was still at the station when a shadow fell across her desk, and she looked up to find General Bowen Hale standing 3 feet away, both his aides gone, his face different now than it had been in the trauma bay. 40 minutes had passed. Dr. Faraday had arrived 27 minutes into that window, reviewed the situation, and taken Marcus Hale into the operating room with a confidence level that Cassandra had assessed as genuine. The word from the OR runner 7 minutes ago was that the surgical hemorrhage had been identified and was being addressed. The general looked like a man who had been standing very straight for a very long time and was not going to stop now, but was tired of it. "He's going to make it," Cassandra said. "The OR runner told me." Hale pulled a chair from the empty desk beside her and sat in it without asking. He looked at her. "You recognize my name?" "Yes." "You didn't say anything." "There wasn't time." He studied her for a long moment. "I've thought about you," he said. "More than once, in ways that weren't charitable." "I know," she said. "I want to know what happened." His voice had not changed registers, still that deep, flat certainty. But there was something under it now that hadn't been there in the trauma bay, and she thought it might be the specific tone of a man who is preparing for the possibility that he has been wrong about something for a very long time. Cassandra set down her pen. She looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I'm not going to tell you tonight," she said. "Not here." His jaw moved. "My son almost died." "I know he did." "You saved his life." "Nolan saved his life. I helped." "That's..." He stopped. "That's not... Why won't you tell me now?" "Because you've had a bad night, and so have I," she said simply. "And because some things deserve to be said when there's enough space to say them correctly." He looked at her for a long time. A man who was used to being answered immediately, used to information arriving on his timeline, sitting in a folding chair at a nurse's station in the middle of the night, because his son was in surgery and the woman he'd blamed for a decade was across from him and declining to give him what he'd come for. "Tomorrow," he said. "I work at 7. "Before 7. She considered him. The lines in his face, the decoration on his uniform, the hand that was still slightly unsteady when he didn't have anything to hold. 6 a.m., she said. The family lounge on the 2nd floor. He nodded once, stood, picked up the chair and put it back exactly where he'd taken it from. He walked 3 steps away and then stopped without turning around. "Captain Hale," he said. "My son. Does he know how close he came?"
Cassandra looked at the OR board. He'll know when he wakes up. The general stood there a moment longer.
Then he walked away and the corridor swallowed him, and Cassandra sat in the quiet of the nurses' station, listening to the monitors and the fog and the sound of 11 years of something she hadn't been able to set down, shifting weight in her chest like a tide that might, for the first time, be going in a different direction. At 3:47 a.m., Garrett Finch came back to the station with a folder and a printed form and set it in front of her without looking at her face. It was a formal notification. Protocol violation, scope of practice, pending administrative review, temporary removal from trauma floor pending outcome. Cassandra picked it up, read it, set it back down. Effective immediately? She asked. End of shift, Garrett said. He still wasn't meeting her eyes. There was something in the set of his shoulders that she recognized as discomfort, not at what he was doing, but at the fact that he might be wrong about it. Karen Mott will have the formal meeting scheduled by Friday. Okay, she said. He hesitated. For what it's worth, Garrett, she said, go home. Get some sleep. She pulled the notification toward her and set it beside her coffee mug. I'm going to finish my shift. He opened his mouth, closed it, left. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up the next chart on the rack and started reading, because there was still 3 hours until the end of her shift, and somewhere in the hospital above her, a young soldier's heart was beating under a surgeon's hands, and she had not done the work she had done tonight, so that she could spend the last 3 hours of it staring at a piece of paper that said she shouldn't have. At 5:12 a.m., her pager went off. She looked at the number. Not a patient, not the OR, not Garrett. It was the extension for the hospital's executive administration wing, a set of offices that was normally empty at this hour, except when something significant enough had happened to bring someone in early. She stood, tucked the pager back in her waistband, and walked to the supply closet and swapped her gloves for a fresh pair out of habit, and then stood there for a moment in the small fluorescent quiet of the closet with a pair of unused gloves in her hand and the weight of the night pressing in around her. Her military discharge papers were in a box under her bed at home. They had been there for 6 years. She had taken them out twice in that time, once when she got the nursing job at Mercy Crest, and once on a night she didn't think about anymore. She knew what was in those papers. The official version. The version that had ended her career and followed her out of every door she'd walked through since then. She also knew what wasn't in them. She put the gloves back, walked out of the closet, made her way to the second floor without answering the page, because it was not yet 6 a.m. and she had made a different appointment. General Bowen Hale was already in the family lounge when she arrived, standing at the window with a cup of coffee that looked untouched. The city outside the glass was still dark, the fog still thick, the lights of Dunmore blurred and distant through it. He heard her come in but didn't turn right away. When he did, his face had the particular texture of someone who had not slept and was not going to admit to that. The OR called at 4:30, he said. Marcus is out. Stable. Critical, but stable. Good, she said. The surgeon said. He stopped. He said if the tamponade had gone another 10 or 15 minutes, we would have had a different conversation. Cassandra sat down at the small table in the center of the room. She looked at her hands. You said you wanted to know what happened, she said. Yes. Sit down, General. He sat. She looked at him across the small table in the gray light of early morning and thought about the 6 years she'd been carrying what she was about to put on that table. The weight of it. The way it had shaped things she hadn't wanted shaped. The way she'd told herself the truth was safe where it was, that bringing it out wouldn't fix anything it needed to fix. She reached into the pocket of her scrub top, not the one with the protein bar. The other one, the left breast pocket, the one she kept zipped, the one she had been moving things into and out of for 11 years, as if the location itself meant something. She set it on the table between them. It was a folded piece of paper, old. The creases worn soft with handling. She'd typed it once, years ago, to preserve it, because the original was deteriorating and she hadn't been ready to lose the words even if she could never use them. General Hale looked at the paper. He did not reach for it. What is that? He said. Read it, she said. The fog pressed against the window. The lounge was very quiet. Somewhere in the hospital, a cart rolled down a corridor and the sound came through the walls, muffled and far away. His hand moved across the table toward the paper and then stopped 2 inches short of it, and in the halted space of that gesture, she saw, for the first time in 6 years, the exact shape of the thing she had been asked to protect, and what protecting it had cost her. And she watched General Bowen Hale's face as his fingers finally closed around the edge of the page. His fingers closed around the edge of the page, and he unfolded it the way you unfold something old, carefully, without rushing, as if he already understood that whatever was inside had been waiting long enough that a few more seconds wouldn't hurt it. Cassandra watched him read. She had memorized the words years ago. She didn't need to see the paper to know what his eyes were moving across. She knew every line of it, every awkward construction, every place where the man who wrote it had crossed something out and started again. Details that weren't visible in the typed copy, but that she carried in memory because she had held the original long enough that the corrections had burned themselves in alongside the words. The general read slowly. He was not a man who skimmed. When he reached the bottom, he didn't look up immediately. He sat with the page in his hands and his eyes on the last paragraph, and the light outside the window went from black to the particular dark gray that precedes dawn in November, that color that isn't quite either thing. "This is his handwriting," he said. His voice had lost something. Not broken. Not that. Just reduced to something more essential. "I typed it," Cassandra said. "The original was deteriorating. I have it at home. I can bring it." "This is Colonel Raymond Voss's handwriting." "Yes." He set the paper on the table. He did not let go of it entirely. His fingers rested at the edge, a light contact, the same way he'd touched his son's arm in the trauma bay, as if the thing might leave if he released it completely. "He ordered you," Hale said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." "He ordered you to take the 6 and leave him." "He was the commanding officer," she said. "He gave a direct order in an active combat situation. I followed it." Bowen Hale's jaw worked. He picked up the coffee cup and put it back down without drinking from it. "You could have told someone. After. You could have—" "He asked me not to." Hale looked up at that. His pale gray eyes had acquired something Cassandra had not expected to see in them this quickly, and she was careful not to name it too fast because it might not be what it looked like, and she had been wrong about things before. "He was dying," she said. "He had maybe 4 minutes of consciousness left, and he used part of them to tell me what he wanted. That his family didn't need to know he'd made that call. That his wife, that Diane didn't need to live with it." She paused. "He said she'd spent 20 years worrying every time he deployed. He didn't want the last thing she had of him to be a choice that could be read 2 ways. The general was very still. "He chose the 6, Hale said. "He chose the 6, she confirmed. "Because they were young, and because the extraction was possible, and because he was already—" "The injury was unsurvivable, General. Not probably unsurvivable. Unsurvivable. He knew that before I did." Hale pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back and his shoulders doing something complicated that she let happen without commentary. She sat at the table and waited. He'd blamed her for 5 years. She knew the shape of that blame because it had touched her life in specific ways. The calls that hadn't come, the clearances that had been quietly questioned, the one job interview that had ended strangely when the panel lead had stepped out to make a phone call and come back different. She'd never been able to prove the thread that connected those things to the man standing at the window. She'd never tried to. Proof required engagement with the narrative, and engagement required using the piece of paper on the table, which Raymond Voss had handed her with the specific instruction that she use her judgment about when and whether. She had decided not to. For 5 years she had decided not to. She had not decided wrong, she thought. She thought she had just decided for a different timeline than she'd expected. Hale turned from the window. His face had been through several things while his back was to her, and had arrived at a version of itself that was exhausted and precise and carrying a specific weight she recognized because she'd worn something similar. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't have to. I made calls." His voice was blunt. "After the inquiry, I knew people. There were conversations I had about your record that I shouldn't have had. He stopped. I want to be honest with you about that. Cassandra looked at him. Okay. That's all you're going to say? What would you like me to say? He almost laughed. It came out as something shorter and quieter and not quite humor. I don't know. I've been standing at that window trying to figure out what a person says when... He stopped again. The general, it turned out, also ran out of words sometimes, which was not something she'd expected to discover about him. Tell me about him, she said. Hale looked at her. Raymond, she said, tell me something I don't know, something... I knew him for 8 months. You knew him for 30 years. He stood there for a moment, and then he pulled the chair back and sat down. And something in the way he did it was different from the way he'd sat down before. Less managed, less military, more like someone who has been standing for a long time and finally accepts the chair. He talked for 20 minutes. She listened. About a man she'd known as a commanding officer and the general had known as a college roommate, as a groomsman, as the person who'd called on a Tuesday morning when Hale's first marriage was ending and said nothing particularly useful, but had driven 4 hours to sit in his kitchen anyway. The picture that assembled itself was specific and human and three-dimensional in the way that the 28-year-old colonel she'd known couldn't have been yet. She didn't fill in her own stories. She let him go where he needed to go. At 6:43 a.m., her pager went off again. Same administration extension. She silenced it. You need to answer that, Hale said. Not yet. He studied her. What's happening with the hospital? She considered what to say and settled on the truth because it was faster and she was tired of the other kind. I'm being reviewed for a scope of practice violation. Garrett Finch is the charge nurse who filed it. It'll go to the nursing board most likely, given the procedure. Hale's expression shifted. Because I guided a resident through a life-saving intervention on your son. Yes. A muscle moved in his jaw. They're disciplining you for saving Marcus. They're disciplining me for operating outside my official scope, she said, which isn't incorrect technically. The question is whether the clinical necessity exception applies, and hospital administration will have a view about that. What's their view going to be? She picked up her coffee, which was also cold by now. The procedure worked. In my experience, that doesn't always matter as much as it should. He stood up again, and this time there was something purposeful in it. I want to talk to someone. General, I have a son alive in the ICU because of what you did in that trauma bay, he said. I am not going to sit here and watch an institution. Sit down, she said. He looked at her. Please, she added, but only because she meant it, not because she needed to soften it. He sat. There's a process, she said. If you go in there with your stars and your voice and your 4 aides and you throw weight at Garrett Finch and Karen Mott today, you will make it worse. The story becomes disruptive military intervention in hospital administration. The story becomes me not being able to handle my own professional situation. She looked at him steadily. I've been handling this particular brand of situation for 11 years. I know what I'm doing. You're telling me to do nothing. I'm telling you to wait. She paused. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the effort it cost him. The specific difficulty of a man who is accustomed to action sitting still in the face of something that feels like injustice. I'm good at waiting, she told him, and the honesty in it was dry enough that it almost wasn't humor, but nearly was. Something crossed his face. Something that wasn't quite a smile either, but was in the same neighborhood. Her pager went off a third time. This time the number was different. Internal extension for the ICU. She looked at it, and her stomach did the specific thing it did when the ICU called and you weren't expecting it. She was already standing when she hit the callback button. The ICU charge nurse's voice came through tightly. Holt, we need you up here. Captain Hale's pressures are dropping again, and Dr. Faraday, I'll be there in 90 seconds, she said, and she was already moving. Behind her, she heard the general's chair push back, and she said without looking back, Wait here, and she pushed through the family lounge door into the corridor and accelerated. The ICU was on the 4th floor. She took the stairs because the elevator in this wing was slow, and she had learned its timing years ago and filed it under things worth knowing. She hit the 4th floor door at speed, not running exactly. There was a difference between moving with urgency and moving in a way that made everyone else panic. and turned left into the ICU corridor. Faraday was there. He'd been there, apparently. He hadn't left the hospital, which told her immediately that he'd shared her concern about the picture. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with silver-framed glasses and the specific unhurried speed of a very good surgeon. He looked at her when she came through the door and said, without preamble, "Residual bleed. The repair is holding, but there's a secondary source we missed. Probably the posterior intercostal. BP 64/40 and declining." She moved to Marcus Hale's bedside. The captain was unconscious, which was appropriate given what he'd been through, but his color was wrong and his pressure readout was doing the thing that pressures did when they didn't plan to stop dropping on their own. "We need to take him back," Faraday said. "I know," she said. She was already checking the lines, the fluids, the positioning. "When?" "Now. I've called the OR. They're pulling the team back in." He paused, looked at her. "You doing okay?" It was such an unexpected question, offered with such straightforward clinical regard, not pointed, not strategic, just genuine, that it caught her for a half second. "I'm fine," she said. "What do you need from me?" "Stay with him until we move. His father is on the second floor. I'll have someone bring him up." Faraday nodded and moved to the phone. Cassandra stood at the bedside and looked at Marcus Hale's face, 29 years old, high cheekbones, a jaw with the same particular angle as his father's, a 3-inch scar along the left temple that looked older than the current situation. His hands were large and still, draped at his sides. Someone had set them there carefully, she thought. Someone had taken care with it. She checked his pressure again. 61/38. She adjusted the fluid rate and checked the secondary line and made a note on the bedside chart. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. She had spent a long time making sure of that, had built the steadiness intentionally, had sometimes, during the years after the discharge, thought of the steadiness as the only part of herself she'd come out of it with intact. Which was not entirely true. She knew that. But it had felt true some nights. The elevator opened at the end of the corridor and General Hale came through it without having waited to be fetched, which surprised her, and then didn't. He came to the bedside and looked at his son, and his face did what faces do when the thing they're looking at is both precious and in danger, and there is very little to be done with your hands about it. "What happened?" he said. "Secondary bleed. He's going back into surgery." She held his gaze. Faraday caught it fast. "This is manageable." "You said that like you mean it." "I do mean it." He looked at her. His jaw was doing the iron thing again, but there was fear underneath it now, visible, not hidden. She thought he had stopped hiding it, possibly in the last 2 hours, and she didn't remark on it because it didn't need remarking on. "Stay," he said. She understood he meant in the hospital, not at the bedside. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The OR team arrived at 7:22 a.m. with a quiet efficiency that was one of the things she genuinely respected about Mercy Crest's surgical staff. They moved Marcus Hale out of the ICU with a minimum of drama and a maximum of competence, and Faraday walked alongside the gurney saying something low and specific to the anesthesiologist that Cassandra didn't catch, but interpreted as good, because Faraday's tone when things were bad was different from his tone when they were difficult, but manageable. And what she'd just heard was the second kind. She and General Hale stood in the suddenly quiet ICU bay. The monitors had been disconnected. The room had the particular empty quality of a space just vacated, tubes and packaging and the indentation in the pillow. "How long?" Hale said. "Probably 2 hours. Maybe 3, depending on what they find." He nodded. He was not going to say anything about the waiting because there was nothing to say about waiting that helped, and she thought he knew that. Her pager went off again. Administration extension. Again. She looked at it. Then she looked at the general, who was looking at the empty bed with both hands at his sides and an expression like a man standing at the edge of something deep. "I have to answer this one," she said. He didn't respond. She wasn't sure he'd heard her. She stepped into the corridor and hit the callback. Karen Mott answered on the second ring. Karen Mott was the director of nursing at Mercy Crest, 60 years old, with the kind of administrative composure that Cassandra had once, early in her tenure there, mistaken for coldness before she'd understood that it was actually a very well-managed version of caring about too many things at once. "Cassandra," Karen said, "I need you in my office." "I'm on the 4th floor," Cassandra said. "General Hale's son is going back into surgery." "I know, this can't wait." Karen's voice was carefully neutral in the way that meant there was something on the other side of it that wasn't. "I have the CMO here and Dr. Harmon from legal. We need to have a conversation about last night." Cassandra leaned against the wall of the corridor. "CMO and legal," she said. "Yes." "Okay." She straightened. "Give me 10 minutes." She went back into the ICU bay. General Hale was still standing at the empty bed. "I have to go to a meeting," she said. "There's a surgery waiting area on the 3rd floor, end of the west corridor. They'll update you there." He turned. He looked at her face and read something in it. "What kind of meeting?" "The administrative kind." She held his gaze. "I told you there was a process. This is the process." "I'm coming." "No," she said with complete calm. "You're not." "Cassandra." "Bowen." She used his first name without thinking about it, and then thought about it and kept going. "You being in that room makes me a woman who needed a 4-star general to fight for her. I am not going to be that." She looked at him steadily. "I know what I did last night, and I know why I did it, and I am going to walk into that office and make that case myself. That is what I need from this situation. Do you understand?" He looked at her for a long time. "Yes," he said, not happy about it, but yes. "3rd floor, west corridor," she said, and she walked out. Karen Mott's office was on the administrative level. 2nd floor, north wing, the part of the hospital that had carpet instead of linoleum and art on the walls that someone had selected with intentionality. Karen's office itself was functional and uncluttered. She had a framed photo of a border collie on her desk and 3 certificates on the wall and a coffee maker that was clearly doing more work than the one in the nurse's station. CMO. Dr. Ellis Harrington was there, tall, angular, with the precise handshake of a man who had been taught to shake hands by someone who considered it an assessment. And the legal representative, Dr. Harmon, who was not actually a physician but had a JD and used the title as a professional courtesy in hospital settings, which Cassandra had always found a mildly interesting choice. Karen gestured to the chair across from her desk. Cassandra sat. "Thank you for coming," Karen said. "Of course." Harrington leaned forward slightly. "We've reviewed the incident report filed by Garrett Finch. We've also looked at the OR notes and spoken briefly with Dr. Faraday." He paused. "The clinical outcome is not in question." "I'm glad to hear that," Cassandra said. "The procedural question is..." He laced his fingers together on the desk. "What you did in Trauma Bay one last night, guiding a first-year resident through a pericardiocentesis, constitutes an action that in most standard readings falls outside the scope of practice for an RN, regardless of prior military training or experiential background." Cassandra let him finish, then, "Dr. Nolan performed the procedure under direct physician supervision." "You directed it." "I assisted it," she said. "The distinction matters." Harmon, from the corner of the room, said, "The nursing board is going to see guidance at that level as functional direction, not assistance." "The patient would have died," Cassandra said. She said it simply, without emphasis. Dr. Faraday was 40 minutes away. The tamponade was progressing at a rate that gave us 15 to 18 minutes. Dr. Nolan is a licensed physician who had not performed the procedure independently, but had the knowledge to do so with experienced support. I provided that support. She looked at Karen. Emergency exception to scope of practice restrictions exists precisely for situations where the alternative is death. "The board will weigh that," Harrington said. "I expect they will." Harmon was making a note. "The issue is less the procedure itself and more the pattern," he said. "You've operated at the edge of your scope before. Twice, in the last 4 years, flagged by charge nurses. Both times in situations where a patient was declining faster than physician coverage could respond. And both times reviewed and no action taken," Karen said, and Cassandra thought she heard something in that, not advocacy, but acknowledgement. Karen was precise about those things. Harrington was less precise. Be that as it may, the severity of last night's intervention is the reason Captain Hale is in surgery right now instead of in the morgue, Cassandra said. I understand that creates a complicated situation for the institution. I'm not pretending otherwise. She looked at Harrington steadily. But I need you to understand that if I were standing in that trauma bay again, with the same patient and the same options, I would do exactly what I did. The room was quiet. Harrington looked at Harmon. Harmon made another note. Karen was looking at Cassandra with an expression that was both professional and something underneath professional that she didn't display often. We're going to need to proceed with the formal review, Harrington said, during which time your access to trauma will be restricted. How restricted? Cassandra said. You'll be assigned to the medical surgical floor pending outcome. She sat with that for a moment. Med-Surg. 4 years ago, she would have said Med-Surg would break her, and she might have been right. She thought now it would be fine. She thought now she was harder to break than she'd known how to be 4 years ago. All right, she said. Your nursing license is not currently in jeopardy, Harmon said carefully, but that may depend on the board's interpretation of... Karen's phone rang. She looked at it. Her face changed. Excuse me, she said, and picked it up. Mott. Cassandra watched Karen's face go through 3 distinct expressions in about 12 seconds. She'd known Karen for 7 years, and she'd never seen that sequence before. Karen set the phone down. She looked at Harrington, then at Cassandra. That was the hospital's main line, she said. There are 4 military vehicles in the parking structure. An Army legal officer is asking to speak with hospital administration. She paused. He says he has documentation relevant to a nursing staff member's employment situation. Harrington blinked. What documentation? Karen looked at Cassandra. Cassandra looked back at her. And for the first time since she'd walked into that office, something in the arithmetic of the situation shifted in a direction she hadn't allowed herself to calculate on, because calculation required a kind of hope that she'd gotten careful about and hadn't quite permitted herself yet. I don't know, Cassandra said, which was true. She also knew, in the specific way you know things you haven't been given permission to know yet, that whatever was in those vehicles had not arrived here by accident, and that the general she'd told to wait on the 3rd floor had not, in fact, waited. Karen Mott set the phone down, and the silence in that office lasted about 4 seconds before Harrington said, "Military legal officers," in the tone of someone repeating words back to confirm they were real. That's what the front desk said, Karen told him. Harmon had stopped writing. His pen was still touching the page, but nothing was coming out of it. Cassandra sat in the chair across from Karen's desk and kept her face from doing the things it wanted to do, which was a skill she'd developed over years and was currently requiring more effort than usual. She had told Bowen Hale to wait on the 3rd floor. She had told him specifically, and with reasoning that she'd believed was sound, and he had apparently looked at that reasoning and made a different calculation. She was not sure how she felt about that. She was also not sure she had the luxury of deciding right now. I'd like to know what documentation they're referencing, Harrington said, looking at Cassandra in a way that suggested he expected her to have an answer. So would I, she said, which was accurate enough. Karen stood. I'll go to the lobby. I'll come, Harrington said. Cassandra stood too. No one told her to sit back down. The 4 of them walked to the elevator. Karen, Harrington, Harmon, and Cassandra, slightly behind, in the particular position of someone who has not been invited, but has also not been excluded, and rode it down to the main floor in the specific silence of people who have not agreed on what is happening yet. The lobby of Mercy Crest was broad and institutional, designed sometime in the 90s to feel welcoming and achieving functional instead. At the main entrance, past the information desk and the revolving doors, stood 3 people Cassandra did not recognize and 1 she did. The 3 she didn't know were in Army dress uniform. 2 were JAG officers. She identified them by insignia. And the 3rd was a non-commissioned officer whose rank patches she clocked automatically, the way she always did before she'd decided to. The one she recognized was Colonel Adela Price, whom she had met exactly once, 4 years after her discharge, at a VA conference in Denver where Price had been on a panel about combat medic transition, and Cassandra had been in the 3rd row not planning to speak to anyone. Price had spoken to her anyway, for about 6 minutes. given her a business card that Cassandra had filed in the same place she filed most things from that period, away, but not thrown away. Price was 47 and built like someone who'd been physically disciplined her entire adult life. She wore her uniform with the ease of someone who didn't have to think about it anymore. She had the card in her hand, not Cassandra's old card, a different one, and she was in the middle of a quiet, measured conversation with the woman at the information desk when she looked up and saw Cassandra across the lobby. Something brief moved across Price's face. Not surprise, more like confirmation. She said something to the desk attendant and walked toward them, the two JAG officers falling in slightly behind her. "Colonel Price," Cassandra said when there was enough distance closed to speak. "Holt!" Price looked at Harrington and Karen in turn. "Dr. Harrington, I'm Colonel Adela Price, Army JAG Corps. I'm here regarding a personnel matter connected to one of your staff members." She didn't gesture toward Cassandra. She didn't need to. "I have documentation that's directly relevant to an active administrative review. I'd like the opportunity to present it." Harrington looked at the JAG insignia. His professional composure was intact but recalibrated. "What kind of documentation?" "Military service records," Price said, "corrected and certified, and a formal communication from the Office of the Army Inspector General." She paused one beat. "I'd prefer to do this in a conference room rather than a lobby." Karen said, "Of course," immediately, which was the right call, and Cassandra noted it. They moved to the second-floor conference room, not Karen's office, the larger one, the one with the oval table and the whiteboard no one ever used, and the window that looked out over the hospital's east parking structure. The military vehicles were visible from it, two black SUVs and a transport, parked in a line with a specificity that was not accidental. Bowen Hale was not visible. Cassandra scanned for him and didn't find him and filed that away. Colonel Price set a briefcase on the table and opened it with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has run this kind of meeting before. She produced a folder, set it on the table, and looked at Harrington. "You're reviewing Cassandra Holt for a scope of practice violation stemming from last night's trauma intervention," Price said. It wasn't a question. "That's correct," Harrington said. "I'm not here to comment on that review," Price said. "That's an institutional matter, and I respect the process. I'm here because the review is happening in the context of a military service record that contains errors that have been pending correction for 6 years, and those errors have had material impact on Cassandra Holt's professional circumstances during that time." Harmon had his notepad out again. Harrington had gone very still. Price opened the folder. She produced a document, 2 pages, stamped with Army letterhead, the red-bordered certification that Cassandra recognized from the original version of her own discharge papers, except the content of this one was different from what those papers said. She slid it across the table. Harrington picked it up. Read. Cassandra did not read it because she was watching Harrington's face, which was more informative. "This says she was honorably discharged," Harrington said. "She was always honorably discharged," Price said. "The original paperwork contained an administrative classification error that mischaracterized the circumstances of her separation from service. That error has been under internal review for 14 months. The corrected record was certified 10 days ago." 10 days ago, Karen said. "Yes." Cassandra sat with that for a moment. 10 days ago. She had not known. She had not known anything was moving, had stopped expecting anything to move, had built a version of her professional life that didn't require it to move. The fact that it had, and that she had not been told, was its own kind of information about how things moved when they moved without you. "The original error," Harrington said carefully, "resulted in what? In a service record that, when reviewed, created the impression that Ms. Holt's separation was connected to a performance failure under combat conditions." Price's voice was level. "It was not. The Inspector General's review established that she performed her duties correctly, under orders, in an impossible situation, and that the original characterization was a documentation failure, not a disciplinary one." The room was quiet except for the distant sound of the hospital operating around them, which did not stop for meetings like this one. "There's a second document," Price said. She set it on the table without sliding it. She placed it deliberately, the way you place something that has weight. "This is a formal commendation. It was authorized 14 months ago when the review opened, but it could not be released pending the record correction. Harrington reached for it, read it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes did. "This is a Silver Star citation," he said. "Yes," Price said. Karen's head came up. "That's—" Harmon stopped writing. "That's a high decoration. The citation details are classified," Price said, "but the award itself is public record from this point forward." She looked at Cassandra directly for the first time since they'd entered the room. "I apologize that it took this long. The review process is not fast." Cassandra looked at the table surface. The wood grain was generic and inoffensive. She focused on it for a moment because it was the kind of thing you could focus on when the inside of your chest was doing something complicated, and you needed your face to stay in one configuration. "Okay," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, and also aware that being proud of it was its own kind of deflection, and that was fine for right now. "I want to be clear," Price said, turning back to Harrington. "The Army's presence here is informational, not coercive. We're not here to tell you how to run your review. We're here because it would have been wrong to let that review proceed while these corrections were sitting in a processing queue that hadn't been communicated to Ms. Holt or her employer." Harrington set the commendation down. He looked at Karen. Karen looked at him. A great deal of something passed between them in that look that Cassandra couldn't fully read, but could partially, the way you read a conversation happening across a room where you can see the mouths moving but not hear the words. Harmon was writing again, quickly. "We'll need time to review these materials," Harrington said. "Of course," Price said. "I'll leave copies. The originals are on file with JAG." She began organizing the papers back into her folder with precise movements. "One more thing." She did not look up from what she was doing. "General Hale contacted my office at 0500 this morning. That's why we were able to get here quickly. He had some urgency about the timeline." Cassandra absorbed that. Bowen Hale had been on the phone at 5 in the morning, before Marcus Hale had gone back into surgery, before the administration meeting, before any of this had visibly escalated. He'd made the call in the dark, early part of the morning, probably from the family lounge before she'd come down, or from the parking structure, or from wherever generals went when they decided to stop waiting. He'd done it quietly. He'd done it before she'd even told him she might need it, which meant he'd understood something she hadn't finished explaining yet. She thought about the man who had driven 4 hours on a Tuesday to sit in a kitchen. She thought about the ways that impulse moved through different decades and different circumstances, and came out looking different on the outside while being the same thing underneath. She looked at the conference room window. The military vehicles were still there in the parking structure, orderly and dark. "Thank you, Colonel Price," she said. Price looked at her. Something in it was specific and unceremonious, the kind of look that passed between people who have both been in situations where ceremony was irrelevant. "You should have had those papers 6 years ago," she said. "I'm sorry you didn't." She closed the briefcase and stood, and the 2 JAG officers stood with her, and they left the conference room in the same quiet order they'd arrived in. The room was different after they left. The same table, the same bad whiteboard, the same east-facing window with the vehicles below it, but the proportions of the room had changed in the way rooms change when the significant thing that was going to happen in them has happened, and now everything else is aftermath. Harrington looked at his hands, then at Cassandra. "I need to speak with the CMO's office," he said, meaning not her, "and with legal." He looked at Harmon. "We'll reconvene this afternoon." "The trauma restriction," Cassandra said. He looked at her. "The assignment to Med-Surg pending review. I'd like to know if that's still in effect." A pause. "I'll need to consult." "I understand," she said. "I'd like to be back on trauma by tonight's shift." It was direct and specific, and she watched him process the directness. Some administrators found it aggressive. Some found it clarifying. She had been in this hospital long enough to know which kind Harrington was, and she'd placed her words accordingly. He stood without answering and left the room. Harmon followed him. Karen stayed. She sat at the table across from Cassandra for a moment, and then she said, "Silver Star." "Apparently," Cassandra said. Karen looked at her with the expression she used when she was about to say something that was outside her normal professional register. She didn't do it often. "You've been here 7 years," she said. "You never said anything about your military background, beyond the basic credentialing. It wasn't relevant to the job. It speaks to who you are as a clinician." "So does the work," Cassandra said. Karen made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Fair enough." She put her palms flat on the table. "I'm going to advocate for you in the review. I want you to know that." Cassandra looked at her. "Thank you. I also want you to know that I would have advocated for you before any of this." She gestured vaguely toward the window and what was outside it. "Arrived." "I know that," Cassandra said. And she did. Karen Mott was one of the 3 or 4 people in the hospital whose professional judgment she trusted without modification. She stood. "I'm going to the surgical waiting area." Karen nodded. "Let me know when you hear anything from the OR." She took the stairs again, not because of the elevator timing this time, because she needed the movement, the specific physicality of climbing, something to put the excess energy into that wasn't her face. She came out on the 3rd floor and turned west and walked to the end of the corridor. Bowen Hale was in the waiting area. He was the only one in it, which was unusual for 8 in the morning. Usually there were 2 or 3 families arranged in the particular formation of people who don't know each other but are bonded by proximity to the OR board. Today it was just him, seated in a chair with his uniform jacket over the back of it and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, which was the most undone she'd seen him look. He heard her coming and looked up. She sat down across from him. "You called Price," she said. "Yes." "Before our conversation this morning, you'd already called." "At 4:50, he said. "I know people at JAG. I knew about the review being in process. Not the timeline, but the fact of it. I didn't know it had been sitting in a queue that long." His jaw tightened briefly. "That's its own problem, and I intend to address it separately." She looked at him. "I told you I didn't want someone fighting my situation for me." "You told me not to come into the administration meeting," he said. "I didn't." She sat with that distinction for a moment. It was technically accurate. She decided not to be irritated by technical accuracy at this particular moment because she was too tired and because she thought his version of it was honest, even if her version of what she'd meant was different. "Thank you," she said. It came out with less reservation than she'd expected. He looked at her with something that was complicated and settled. "Don't thank me for 6 years late," he said. "I'm not thanking you for 6 years late," she said. "I'm thanking you for this morning." He didn't respond to that. He looked at the OR board on the wall, the whiteboard with patient numbers and procedure codes that was the only update this room offered while the surgeons were in. Marcus Hale, in OR 3. Status, active. "Faraday's good," she said, not for the first time. She meant it not for the first time either. "I know," he said. Then, after a pause, "I read Raymond's letter on the way down. I'd already read it twice in the lounge. I read it a 3rd time in the elevator." She said nothing. "He wrote it the night before the operation," Hale said. "I recognized his handwriting even through the typing, the way he phrased certain things. We had a language, 30 years of it. He was saying goodbye, wasn't he, in the parts between the order?" "I think so," she said. "Yes." Hale looked at the OR board. "He didn't tell you to give it to me specifically." "He said I'd know when and whether," she said. "For a long time I decided whether was no. What changed it to yes?" She considered the honest answer, which was complicated and not fully resolved in her own mind, and chose the most accurate part of it. "Your son needed a surgeon," she said, "and you needed a reason to let me be the one to find him one." Hale looked at her. The pale gray eyes held something that wasn't simple. "That's—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know what to do with the years," he said. "The ones where I made calls about your record, where I told people things I believed but didn't verify." "You don't have to do anything with them right now," she said. "That feels insufficient." "Most honest things do," she said. He almost made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh again. She was beginning to recognize it as a specific register of his, the one that acknowledged something true that wasn't comfortable. Her pager went off. She looked at it. Extension for OR3. She stood without explaining and walked to the wall phone and picked it up. Holt! The OR nurse's voice came through clear. Dr. Faraday wanted you to know they've located the bleed. Posterior intercostal, as he suspected. He says it's addressed and the repair is holding. Estimated close in 40 minutes. Thank you, she said. Any complications during? No significant additional findings. Patient tolerating well. She hung up and turned back to the waiting area. Bowen Hale was watching her face. They found it, she said. It's repaired. He'll be out in 40 minutes. The general closed his eyes, just for a moment. His hands, which had been on his knees, made a brief involuntary motion and then stilled. When he opened his eyes again, they were the same as before. Controlled, precise. But something in the geography around them was different, and she turned slightly away to give him the privacy of it without making the turning obvious. She looked at the OR board. He recovered in about 10 seconds, which she noted without judgment as an impressive speed for a man who had just sat through the better part of 12 hours not knowing if his son would walk out of this building. He's going to want to know what happened, Hale said. Marcus. When he wakes up. He'll get the medical rundown from Faraday. I mean, the other part. He looked at her. About you. About why his father walked into that trauma bay ready to remove the person who saved his life. You don't have to tell him everything at once, she said. He'll ask. Soldiers usually do, she agreed. You can tell him the short version first. You were wrong about something for a long time and then you weren't anymore. Hale considered this. That's the short version. It covers the relevant information. He was quiet for a moment, then, what about you? What do you tell people when they ask why you left the army? I don't usually tell them I left the army, she said. He absorbed that. The specific economy of it, the way she'd built a professional life around the absence of that particular narrative. He seemed to understand what it had cost. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. But the format of the number was one she recognized. A government exchange, the kind that came from an official device rather than a personal one. She read it. She read it again. She looked up from her phone, and for a moment she didn't speak, because the thing in the message was specific enough that she wanted to make sure she'd understood it correctly before she said anything about it. What? Hale said. She looked at him. Did you authorize something beyond the record correction? His expression didn't change in any way she could pinpoint. What does the message say? It says a representative of the Surgeon General's office is scheduled to speak with hospital administration at 11 a.m. regarding Mercy Crest's trauma protocols and the role of advanced practice nursing standards in critical care emergencies. She kept her eyes on his face. That's not JAG. That's not the Inspector General. No, he said. Bowen, the Surgeon General's office has been developing updated guidelines on trauma nursing scope in field-equivalent emergency situations, he said. His voice was exactly what it always was, that flat, certain register. But she could hear something deliberate in it now. I may have mentioned that a relevant case study had presented itself. She stared at him. You told me not to come into the meeting, he said. I didn't. You sent the Surgeon General's office to the meeting. A representative, he said. Not the Surgeon General. She stood up. Not in anger, or not primarily. It was the kind of standing up that happens when the body needs more room than a chair allows because something large has just happened and it's processing in the chest and the legs. She walked to the window at the end of the waiting area. The parking structure was visible from this angle too. The military vehicles were still there. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, looking at the vehicles and at the November sky above the parking structure, which had gone from black to dark gray to a particular pale thin blue that meant the fog was finally breaking. She thought about what the next few hours were going to look like. Harrington and the Surgeon General's representative in a conference room. Harmon with his notepad, probably more frantic than before, Karen advocating, as she'd said she would. The corrected service record on the table alongside the Silver Star citation. The nursing board review, which would still happen, but happening now in a context that was architecturally different from the one it had been scheduled for this morning. She thought about MedSurg, She thought about the trauma cart she'd pulled from the supply alcove last night without being asked. She turned around. Hale was watching her from the waiting area chair with the expression of a man who has made a decision he believes in but is not certain how it's going to land. "What you did," she said slowly, "may have just changed the scope of practice conversation for trauma nurses nationally." "That's the Surgeon General's concern, not mine," he said. "My concern is narrower. Your concern is one nurse's employment situation." "My concern," he said, "is what Raymond Voss asked of you, and what that asking cost you, and what I spent 5 years adding to that cost, and what the correct response to all of that looks like at 8:15 in the morning when I'm the only person in this building with the standing to do something about it." The waiting area was very quiet. From somewhere down the corridor came the sound of a cart, and a voice on an intercom calling an extension, and the ordinary ongoing business of a hospital that didn't know or care what was happening in its West Wing third-floor waiting room. Cassandra looked at Bowen Hale. She thought about the letter in her pocket. The original, at home under her bed. The 6 years and the box, and the 2 times she'd opened it. She thought about the specific gravity of things carried for a long time, and what happened to the body when you started to set them down. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way that real things get put down, which is slowly and unevenly and with awareness that the weight has changed the shape of you, and some of that shape is staying. She was about to say something, she wasn't certain what, when her phone buzzed again. She looked at it, expecting the government exchange. It was Garrett Finch. She answered it because she answered things. "Cassandra." His voice was different from the last time she'd spoken to him. Tighter. Something in it she hadn't heard from Garrett before, which was the particular timbre of someone who is dealing with a situation he did not anticipate and is not enjoying. "Karen wants everyone in the second-floor conference room at 9 o'clock. HR, legal, CMO, me, you." A pause. "There's been a development." "The Surgeon General's office," she said. A silence. "How do you know about that?" "I'll be there at 9, she said, and ended the call. She looked at Hale. He had heard enough to read the general shape of it. 9 o'clock, she said. He nodded. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where she'd left it when she'd sat down, and she was threading her arm through the sleeve when the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened and 3 people she didn't recognize came out. 2 in civilian clothes, 1 in a uniform different from the Army's, and all 3 moving with the specific, purposeful speed of people who know where they're going because they've been told exactly where it is. She stopped with her jacket half on. The person in the lead, civilian, dark blazer, the kind of purposeful, efficient walk that Cassandra associated with government offices and Senate hearings, looked at her phone and then looked up and directly at Cassandra with the expression of someone who had been provided a description in advance. "Ms. Holt?" she said. "Yes," Cassandra said. "I'm Deputy Liaison Prentice, Surgeon General's office." She extended her hand. "We need to speak before the 9 o'clock meeting. There's a development you should be aware of." Cassandra shook the hand. "What development?" Prentice glanced briefly at General Hale in the waiting area and then back at Cassandra. "The nursing board," she said. Her voice was precise and without drama, which was the kind of voice that preceded significant things. "They've moved up their review. Someone filed an emergency petition to accelerate the timeline." She paused. "It was filed at 6 this morning, and it's not coming from the hospital." Cassandra went still. "Who filed it?" she said. Prentice looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone delivering information they know is going to require a moment to process. "A former colleague of yours," she said. "A Dr. Warren Felt. He filed citing patient safety concerns and what he's characterizing as a pattern of dangerous overreach." She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. He's also contacted 2 local news stations. Warren Felt. Cassandra stood in the 3rd-floor corridor with her jacket half on and said the name in her head once, the way you say a name when you're checking whether the recognition is accurate before you let it become something. It was accurate. Warren Felt had been the attending physician on the medical surgical floor at Mercy Crest for 4 years before transferring to a different department, A lateral move that everyone at the nurses' station had understood was not lateral, even if the official paperwork called it that. He was 53, trained at a decent program, competent in the specific narrow way of someone who had optimized for not being wrong rather than for being right. He had an opinion about nurses that he'd never stated directly, but had expressed through 100 small transactions over 4 years. The way he spoke across them in patient rooms, the way he'd once described a nursing intervention as well-intentioned improvisation, in a tone that made clear improvisation was not a compliment. He and Cassandra had clashed twice in documented settings and an indeterminate number of times in undocumented ones. The second documented clash, 2 years ago, had resulted in a formal complaint that Karen Mott had reviewed and declined to escalate. Cassandra did not know whether Felt knew that Karen had declined or what he'd thought about that outcome. Apparently he had thought about it enough to file at 6 in the morning. She finished putting on her jacket. "How did he know about the review?" she said to Prentice. "We don't know yet," Prentice said. "The petition is public record once filed. The timing suggests he had information before it was public." Someone had told him. Not Karen. Cassandra removed that possibility immediately, without drama. Not Faraday. Not Nolan, who was a first-year resident and not in Felt's professional orbit. Garrett Finch had filed the original incident report. Garrett Finch had professional overlap with Felt that was not extensive but existed. She'd seen them speak in corridors, seen them at the same departmental meetings. She didn't know what their relationship was beyond that. She hadn't needed to know until this morning. "The news stations," she said. "What's the angle he gave them?" "Nurse overreach. Patient safety risk. He's framing it as a systemic problem with inadequate supervision in the trauma unit." Prentice's voice was level and informational. "He used your name." Behind her, she heard General Hale stand up. "He can do that?" Hale said. He was not asking if it was legal. He was asking something closer to how. "He filed a public petition," Prentice said, looking at him with the calibrated neutrality of someone who has learned to manage 4-star generals in professional settings. "His name and the filing are public. He gave interviews." "What stations?" Cassandra said. "KNDT and Channel 9. Morning slots. One of them aired already, about 40 minutes ago." Prentice looked at her. "I'm sorry, the timing was designed to get ahead of any administrative response." Cassandra looked down the corridor. The pale blue sky was still visible through the waiting area window, the fog still breaking apart in pieces. She thought about 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago, she had been in Karen Mott's office, looking at a corrected service record she hadn't known existed while Felt was on a local news segment calling her a safety risk. She thought about the residents she'd worked beside, the nurses, the patients she'd covered for 11 years. She thought about the specific kind of damage that a morning news segment did, the particular speed of that kind of narrative, how it moved faster than the truth, how it found its audience before the other side had finished getting dressed. She was angry. She noted the anger the way she noted vital signs, present, significant, not yet at a level that required intervention. "The 9 o'clock meeting," she said. "What's the Surgeon General's office's position going into it?" Prentice looked at her squarely. "We're there to provide context on the clinical standards question. Whether an RN with advanced combat medical training in a no physician of record scenario, providing directional assistance during an emergency procedure falls within a defensible scope of practice." She paused. "Our position is that it does. The policy language to support that is in draft. It hasn't been published yet." "So you're arguing from unpublished guidelines?" "We're arguing from clinical reality that the guidelines are catching up to," Prentice said. "It's a weaker position than I'd like, but it's not an indefensible one." Cassandra looked at her watch. 8:22. "I need 30 minutes, she said. Prentice waited. "I need to make a phone call and I need to look at something in my locker," Cassandra said. "I'll be in the second-floor conference room at 8:55. Prentice nodded once. "We'll be set up." Cassandra looked at Hale. He was reading her face with the attention he'd been applying to her face since the family lounge, the way someone reads a situation they've realized is more complex than they initially assessed. "I'm not going to tell you to wait this time," she said. "Good," he said.
She walked to the stairwell. The locker room on the first floor was staff only, accessed by badge, emptied at this hour of its usual early shift population. Cassandra's locker was in the second row, middle height, distinguished from the others by nothing except the small scratch on the door handle from the time she'd dropped her ring of keys 2 years ago and they'd caught the metal. She opened it. Her street clothes. Her regular bag. A stethoscope she kept as backup. And behind those things, in the back corner, a manila envelope that had been there for 3 months, since the day a certified letter from the Army's records office had arrived at her home address, and she'd brought it in meaning to deal with it during a break, and then hadn't, because the energy required to open official Army mail had turned out to be more than she'd had that particular week, or the weeks following. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a preliminary notification, not the final corrected record, which Price had produced that morning, but a precursor to it. A letter from an administrative review officer informing her that her case had been reopened and requesting confirmation of her current contact information. 3 months old. She'd read the first 2 lines, felt the specific thing that happens when you've stopped expecting something and it appears anyway, and put it in the back of the locker. She read it now, the whole thing, standing in the empty locker room with the locker door open. Then she took out her phone and made a call. It rang 4 times. She'd expected voicemail and was prepared for it. Holt. The voice on the other end was rough with sleep, or maybe just morning. Deb Salazar always sounded like that before 10. Deb was a nurse attorney, a woman who had been a trauma nurse for 12 years before going to law school, and who now consulted on nursing practice law in Colorado and 3 adjacent states. She was not Cassandra's attorney. She was someone Cassandra had met at a conference 6 years ago and had coffee with twice a year and called when she needed to think out loud with someone whose judgment she trusted. "I have a situation," Cassandra said. "I'm listening," Deb said, and the roughness sharpened. Cassandra talked for 4 minutes. She covered the procedure, the incident report, the corrected military record, the Surgeon General's liaison, and Warren Felt and his 6 a.m. petition and his morning news appearance, in that order. When she finished, Deb was quiet for a moment. "Felt filed a petition to the nursing board," Deb said. "Yes. And he went to news stations the same morning, 40 minutes before I knew about it." "That's coordinated," Deb said. "That's not a guy who was angry and made a phone call. That's someone who had a plan." A pause. "Does he have any professional connection to your hospital administration?" Cassandra thought of Garrett Finch. "Possibly, indirectly." "Has he filed against nurses before?" She didn't know. That was worth finding out. "What I need from you," Cassandra said, "is a referral. Someone who can be in a conference room in..." She looked at her watch. 31 minutes. Deb made a sound. "Cass, it's 8:25 in the morning." "I know what time it is." Another pause. "Let me call someone." Then, "He went to the news with your name before the review is even done. That's potentially defamatory if the board clears you." Her voice had moved entirely into the professional register now, sleep roughness gone. "Document everything, every communication, every timestamp. Can you get me the petition filing number?" "I'll text it." "Do that now, before the meeting." A brief pause. "I can't be there in 30 minutes, but I know someone who might be." "That's all I need," Cassandra said. She ended the call and texted the filing number from Prentice's paperwork and put the manila envelope in her bag and closed her locker and walked out of the locker room and back to the stairs. The second-floor conference room had been rearranged in the 40 minutes since she'd left it. The oval table had acquired 3 laptops, a small projector, and the Surgeon General's liaison people, who had deployed with a quiet efficiency that suggested they did this kind of thing regularly. Prentice was at the head of the table, or what had become the head. The 2 people with her were introduced to Cassandra as a clinical policy analyst and a medical legal specialist, both of whose names she registered and held. Harrington arrived at 8:58 with Harmon and a woman Cassandra didn't recognize who turned out to be from the hospital's communications office, a detail that told her the administration was already thinking about the media angle. Karen came in at 9 exactly and looked at the room and then at Cassandra with an expression that asked a question without asking it. Cassandra gave a small nod that said, "I know about Felt." Karen's jaw tightened by a fraction. She sat. Garrett Finch was the last one in. He arrived at 9:03
and looked at the composition of the room. The Surgeon General's people, the lawyer who had appeared alongside Cassandra, Deb's contact, a woman named Silva, who had arrived impressively at 8:56 with a leather portfolio and no apparent surprise at any of the situation. And something in Garrett's face did a calculation and didn't like the result. He sat at the far end of the table, which was where there was space, and which also happened to be the position with the least direct eye contact with the head. Prentice opened. She was efficient. She laid out the Surgeon General's office's position on advanced practice nursing scope in trauma emergencies, the clinical basis, the mortality data on delayed surgical coverage in regional medical centers, the gap between current policy language and documented clinical need. She did not mention Cassandra by name in the first 7 minutes except once, as a case reference. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the geometry. Harrington asked 3 careful questions. Harmon took notes with renewed intensity. Then Harrington said, "We also need to address the nursing board petition that was filed this morning." Prentice nodded. "I'm aware of it. The petitioner is alleging a pattern of overreach," Harrington said, "that changes the scope of what the board will examine." Silva, from Cassandra's side of the table, said, "The petition was filed at 6:07 a.m., prior to any formal administrative determination by this hospital, prior to the board's normal intake process." She set 2 pages on the table. "The filing also contains at least one factual error regarding the specifics of last night's procedure, which we've documented." She paused. "We'll be requesting that the board note the timeline and the error in its intake review." Harrington looked at the pages. Garrett was looking at the table surface in front of him. "The petitioner also gave media interviews this morning," Silva continued, "using Ms. Holt's name in connection with allegations that have not been adjudicated. We're assessing that separately." The communications officer shifted in her seat. Karen spoke for the first time. "I'd like to say something about the employment history." Everyone looked at her. "Cassandra Holt has been at this hospital for 7 years. In that time, she has been the subject of 2 prior scope reviews. Both were found to be without basis for action. I reviewed both of them personally." She looked at Harrington, not at Garrett, which was its own statement. "The pattern the petition claims to document is not the pattern I've observed as director of nursing." Garrett said, "Karen." "I'm not finished," Karen said, with the specific pleasantness that was more effective than sharpness. She finished. Harrington looked at his hands for a moment. Then Garrett said, "The procedure last night was a judgment call that a nurse shouldn't have been in a position to make, regardless of outcome." "Dr. Nolan made the procedure call," Cassandra said from across the table. She said it without heat. "I provided assistance. The attending surgeon was not available, and the patient had a 15-minute window. The outcome you're referencing is that Captain Hale is alive. Protocol. Protocol doesn't account for the specific situation we were in last night." She looked at him. "You were there, Garrett. You saw the timeline. You chose not to remove me, which I think means some part of your judgment in that room agreed with mine, even if this," she indicated the room with a small gesture, "is a different conversation." Garrett looked at the table. He didn't answer. In the absence of an answer, the room filled in its own interpretation, which was not charitable. The meeting ran until 10:45. By the end of it, 3 things had been established without being formally voted on, in the way things get established in conference rooms before the paperwork catches up. That the Surgeon General's office would be submitting a formal policy comment to the Colorado Nursing Board in connection with the petition. That the hospital's internal review would proceed but with the corrected military record and the Silver Star citation as part of the evidentiary file. And that the communications office would be preparing a statement for the 2 news stations that had aired Felt's interviews. After the others had mostly filed out, Karen stayed behind. "Felt called Garrett," she said, when the room had emptied to just the 2 of them. It wasn't a question. Cassandra looked at her. "I don't know that for certain," Karen said, "but I know Garrett sent the incident report at 11:47 p.m. and that Felt's petition was filed at 6:07 a.m., 6 hours. That's enough time for a phone call and a plan." She looked at the table. "If that's what happened, there will be consequences for Garrett beyond the scope of this review." "He filed an accurate incident report," Cassandra said. Karen looked at her, slightly surprised. "What I did last night was outside my documented scope," Cassandra said. The report isn't wrong. His judgment about how it should be handled, those are different questions. She picked up her bag. I'm not asking for anyone to come after Garrett. Even if he tipped Felt? Cassandra thought about it honestly. About Garrett in the trauma bay, with his hand that had dropped to his side. About Garrett who had delivered the disciplinary notice and couldn't meet her eyes doing it. She thought about the ways people behaved badly from something smaller than malice, from discomfort, from the need to feel like they'd taken the correct procedural position, from a phone call with someone who made them feel like they had company in their concern. If he tipped Felt, she said, he'll have to live with what Felt did with it. That's enough. Karen looked at her for a moment. You're more generous than I would be. I'm not generous, Cassandra said. I'm tired and I want to go check on my patient. She was halfway to the door when Karen said, You're back on trauma tonight. I'm not waiting for the formal review outcome. You're back. Cassandra stopped. She turned. Karen was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and is comfortable with it and doesn't require the other person to respond extensively. Thank you, Cassandra said. She went to the 4th floor. Marcus Hale had come out of surgery at 10:20 and been moved back to the ICU. He was listed in serious but stable condition, which was a meaningful upgrade from critical. Faraday was at the nurse's station when Cassandra arrived, writing notes on a tablet with the relaxed focus of a man whose work was done and done correctly. Nice repair, she said. Clean once we got to it. He didn't look up. You're going to want to look at his post-op pressure. It's running a little low on the diastolic. Nothing alarming, but worth watching. I'll check it. He did look up then. He looked at her for a moment with a directness that was characteristic of him. Not invasive, just present. Whatever's happening administratively, he said, I want you to know I said what I said to them about last night. Which was? That you caught the tamponade before I would have, he said. He said it without any particular drama, the way he might report a lab value. I was 40 minutes away. If you hadn't been there and done what you did, the conversation would have been different. You'd have caught it on your way in, she said. Maybe, he said, but maybe and definitely are different things. He went back to his notes. That's all. Go check his diastolic. She went into Marcus Hale's bay. The captain was unconscious, which was right. He was still hooked to the monitors, still pale, still carrying the physical evidence of the last 18 hours in every readout and in the drains and lines coming in and out of him. She checked his diastolic, 62, which was low normal and acceptable for where he was post-operatively. She checked the drain output, the fluid balance, the temperature readings. She adjusted one fluid rate by a small increment, noted it, moved on to his chart. She was finishing the chart when she became aware of someone at the bay entrance and looked up to find General Hale standing there. He was back in his uniform jacket. He'd combed his hair. He looked exhausted in a way he was no longer trying to fully manage, which she thought was actually better. Easier to read and easier to be around. How is he? Hale said. Stable, she said. His pressures are acceptable. He'll probably start coming out of anesthesia in the next hour or two. Hale nodded. He looked at his son for a moment. The meeting, how did it go? There's a process, she said. The process is in motion. That's not an answer. It's the most accurate one I have right now. She set the chart down. Felt's petition is going to be examined in a different context than he intended. That's not nothing. Is it enough? She thought about that. About what enough looked like, practically. The nursing board review, the Surgeon General's policy comment, the communication statement, the corrected record, the specific slow grind of institutions correcting themselves. I don't know yet, she said, but the direction is different than it was at 6 this morning. He looked at her. Felt. You know him. We've worked together. Is this about you personally, or is it about a principle he's been nursing? He caught the word and didn't apologize for it. For a while. Both, probably, she said. Those things don't usually separate cleanly. He looked at his son again. At the monitors, the lines, the careful architecture of post-surgical recovery. He's going to have a scar, Hale said. Marcus, on the left side, below the shoulder. Yes. He has a lot of them already. Scars. He said it without any visible emotion and with all of it contained in the saying anyway. Every time there's a new one, He stopped. She let the stop be a stop. I'm not very good at this part, he said, the waiting and the not controlling. You're doing fine, she said. He looked at her with a dryness that suggested he knew she was being kind rather than accurate. You're surviving it, she amended. That's the actual goal. He almost made the sound again, not quite a laugh. She was collecting them now, cataloging them the way she cataloged vital sign patterns. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it and went still. Text from Deb Salazar. Short. Call me before you do anything else. Found something on Felt. It's not good. For him. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she looked at General Hale, who was watching her face again. Something? He said. Maybe, she said. She stepped out of the bay and called Deb, who picked up on the first ring this time. Talk, Cassandra said. I pulled Felt's public record, Deb said. He's filed nursing board petitions before. 3 times in the last 8 years across 2 states. All 3 involved nurses who had formally or informally raised concerns about his practice. Deb's voice was precise and entirely awake now. One of those cases, a nurse in Denver 6 years ago, the board found the petition to be retaliatory. Felt received a formal censure, which he did not disclose when he credentialed at Mercy Crest. Cassandra stood in the corridor outside Marcus Hale's bay and listened to what Deb said next, which was specific and documented, and was the kind of thing that, when it landed in the right place, had consequences that Felt had not calculated for this morning when he picked up his phone at 5-something a.m. and called Garrett Finch. She asked 2 questions, got 2 answers. She thanked Deb and ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment with the information settling into the architecture of everything else. Then she walked to the nurse's station and picked up the internal phone and dialed Karen Mott's extension. Karen answered in 2 rings. I need you to pull Warren Felt's credentialing file, Cassandra said, specifically his history of nursing board interactions in Colorado and any adjacent states. She paused. There's a censure in Denver 6 years ago. It's not in the file. A silence. Then, how do you know that? Because someone checked, Cassandra said. Another silence, shorter. I'll pull it now. Cassandra hung up. She walked back to Marcus Hale's bay. The general was in the same position, standing at the foot of his son's bed, looking at the monitors. What was that? He said. Felt filed 3 petitions against nurses in 8 years, she said. All 3 were nurses who'd raised concerns about his work. He received a formal censure from the Colorado Board for retaliatory filing. He didn't disclose it when he joined Mercy Crest. She looked at Hale. That's a credentialing violation. It will trigger a mandatory review of his employment status. Hale was quiet for a moment. He built a career on it, he said. Not quite a question. He built a pattern on it, she said. That's different. I don't think it was a career goal. I think it's what happens when someone is afraid of being found wrong and has enough institutional access to do something about the people who might find them wrong. Hale looked at her. And the news stations. He gave interviews with a nurse's name and a patient safety angle, she said. That's public. The censure once disclosed is also going to be public. She picked up the chart she'd set down earlier. The stations that ran his story will need to run the corrected story. That's not my call to make, but someone will make it. She finished updating the chart. She dated it, timed it, initialed it. She set it back in the rack. From the hallway came the sound of Karen Mott's voice, measured, direct, carrying the weight of someone who had found the thing she was looking for and was already several steps into what happened next. And from the bed, at the edge of Cassandra's peripheral vision, something changed. She turned. Marcus Hale's hand had moved. Just the fingers, a small unconscious motion, the kind that preceded waking, and his head had turned 2 degrees on the pillow, and behind the closed eyelids something was shifting. She checked the monitor, checked the time, made a note. General Hale had seen it too. He was looking at his son's hand with the expression she'd seen twice now. The controlled terror version, the one that was actually the closest thing to uncontrolled she'd observed from him. He's starting to come out, she said quietly. Hale stood very still. It takes time, she said. The anesthesia, the blood loss, it'll be gradual. But he's there. Marcus Hale's fingers moved again, slightly, purposeful this time, in the way a soldier moves even unconscious, like the body is checking what it has available. Then his eyes opened. Not all the way, not in any cinematic sense. It was the specific, incomplete opening of someone who has been under anesthesia and is encountering consciousness from a distance and finding it not entirely welcome. Squinted, disoriented, the pupils working. He looked at the ceiling first, then slowly, at enormous cost, to the left. He found his father's face. Something moved across Marcus Hale's expression that was too complex to name. Recognition, relief, confusion, the beginning of questions he didn't have the capacity to form yet. General Bowen Hale, 4-star 60-something, a man who had held his face in controlled configurations for decades, and who had been managing the terror underneath it for the better part of 20 hours, reached forward and put his hand over his son's hand and said nothing at all because there was nothing that needed to be said, and he appeared to finally know that. Cassandra watched the monitor. The heart rate was steady. The pressures were holding. She stepped back from the bedside to give the space to what it was for. She was almost at the bay door when Marcus Hale's voice came, rough, minimal, the voice of someone who had used his last reserves to get here. Who? He said. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at her. Who did the procedure? Cassandra stopped. She looked at him. His eyes were not fully focused, but they were tracking her, asking the question with more precision than his condition warranted. She glanced at his father. Hale looked at her, and then at his son, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. She did, Hale said. His voice was quiet. Her name is Cassandra Holt. A pause. She's the reason you're alive. Another pause, briefer. And I owe her an explanation I'm going to give you when you're awake enough to hear it. Marcus Hale's eyes moved back to Cassandra, held there for a moment with the specific gravity of a man who is remembering he is alive and assigning that fact to a cause. She nodded once, which was all the situation needed from her. She stepped into the corridor. Karen Mott was walking toward her from the direction of the administrative wing, the credentialing file in her hand, her expression carrying the particular set of someone who has confirmed what they didn't want to confirm. The censure is not in the file, Karen said, when she was close enough to speak without broadcasting. His credentialing form has a section for board actions. It's blank. Who reviewed his credentialing when he joined? Cassandra said. Karen looked at her for a moment. Ellis Harrington was on the credentialing committee, she said. 4 years ago. The corridor was very quiet. Cassandra looked at the file in Karen's hand, at the blank section, at the name at the top of the form. She thought about Warren Felt, who had built 3 petitions over 8 years and a news segment over one night, and had arrived at this moment believing the momentum was entirely with him. She thought about Ellis Harrington in the conference room this morning, looking at her corrected service record. She thought about what it meant that the censure wasn't in the file, and about whether the omission was deliberate and how you prove that and what happened if you could, and about the specific way institutions protected themselves until the moment they couldn't anymore, and about the moment itself, what it looked like when it came to the people who'd been on the other side of it for too long. Karen was looking at her. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about Warren Felt and Ellis Harrington, Cassandra said. Karen told her in the corridor, in the specific low register of someone who had been holding information at a careful distance and had just run out of reasons to keep doing that. It wasn't a long story. The connection between Warren Felt and Ellis Harrington went back 11 years, to a hospital system in New Mexico where both of them had worked within overlapping departments and had served on the same credentialing committee. Not friends, exactly. Karen didn't think friendship was the right word, more like the kind of professional alignment that develops between people who share a particular view of how hospitals should be organized and who belongs in which part of them. Felt believed in hard lines between physician authority and nursing function. Harrington believed in administrative predictability and the avoidance of liability exposure. Both of those beliefs had, over years, quietly reinforced each other. When Felt had applied to Mercy Crest 4 years ago, Harrington had been on the committee. The censure from the Colorado board was on the application, Karen now believed, because she had spoken this morning with the administrator who'd handled the initial paperwork, a woman named Trudy Marsh, who remembered the file and remembered that it had gone to the committee complete. She remembered specifically because the censure notation had been unusual, and she'd flagged it as something the committee should discuss. It was not discussed. The committee had approved Felt's application without any noted review of the censure, which meant either the committee had not read the flagged section, which was possible and represented negligence, or the committee had read it and the CMO had made a decision about it that was never documented, which was a different kind of problem entirely. Trudy still has her copy of the original application, Karen said. She kept it because she's a careful person. Cassandra looked at the credentialing file in Karen's hand, the blank section where the censure should have been transferred to the official record, the paper version of a decision someone had made and then removed the evidence of. You need to give that file to Silva, Cassandra said. Silva was the legal specialist Deb had sent, still in the building from what Cassandra knew. And you need to get Trudy Marsh on the phone with her before Harrington has any opportunity to know what you found. Karen looked at her for a moment. There was something in her expression that was not quite guilt. Karen hadn't done anything wrong, but was adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of realizing that something bad had been happening in a place you'd been paying careful attention to, and you'd still missed it. I should have pulled his full record when he joined, Karen said. His record passed through a CMO who had reason to approve it, Cassandra said. You weren't going to find what wasn't in the file. That's not... Karen, Cassandra said. Go call Trudy. Go now. Karen went. Cassandra stood in the 4th floor corridor for 30 seconds and did the thing she sometimes did, which was to make no movement and let everything she knew arrange itself into its actual shape rather than the shape it had appeared to be in when the pieces were still arriving. She had spent 11 years developing this particular stillness. It was not calm, exactly. It was more like the eye of something, not peaceful, but clear. The shape, once arranged, was this. Warren Felt had used an institutional system against 3 nurses over 8 years, had been caught and censured once, and had then found a position inside an institution whose CMO had a compatible worldview and had ensured the censure didn't slow him down. When a nurse he perceived as a threat to his particular order had performed an act that gave him procedural standing to come after her, he had moved fast, and he had moved publicly, because fast and public was the version of this that was hardest to walk back. What he hadn't known was that the morning he chose to move was also the morning the architecture beneath him was changing. He also hadn't known that the credentialing file existed in 2 versions. She took out her phone and texted Silva the 3 sentences she needed to know, and went back to the nurse's station to finish what remained of her shift. The next 4 hours were not dramatic. That was the thing about consequences, except the significant ones, the real ones. They mostly happened in conference rooms and on phone calls and in the dry language of official documentation, while the people at the center of them did the ordinary work of whatever the day required. Cassandra checked on patients, updated charts, responded to 2 minor situations in adjacent bays, ate the second half of the protein bar she'd never finished, and at one point sat in the break room for 6 minutes, and drank coffee that was genuinely bad and didn't care. At 1:15 p.m., Silva called her. The credentialing file discrepancy is documented, Silva said. Trudy Marsh provided her original. We have both versions. The board has been notified that the petition was filed by someone with an undisclosed and directly relevant disciplinary history. A brief pause. The board is not required to act immediately, but in practice, when a petitioner's own standing is compromised, the direction of the review shifts significantly. What happens to Felt? Cassandra said. Professionally? He has a credentialing violation at Mercy Crest that will trigger a mandatory review of his employment. He has a board censure that will now be part of his official record at this institution. The media interviews he gave this morning are on the record. Silva's voice was precise and completely without satisfaction, which Cassandra respected. He will, in all likelihood, not work in this hospital system again. The petition will probably be dismissed. Whether the board chooses to examine his pattern across multiple states is a separate proceeding that I can't predict. And Harrington. A pause that was longer than the others. Dr. Harrington has been asked to provide a written account of the credentialing committee's review of Felt's application 4 years ago. That account is being requested by hospital legal, not by me. Another pause. He's retained personal counsel. Cassandra looked at the break room wall. Someone had put up a printed photograph of a mountain range, the kind of generic calming image that hospitals placed in rooms where people sat under stress. The mountains were generic, and the photograph was slightly crooked. "Okay," she said. "One more thing," Silva said. KNDT, the station that aired Felt's interview, has been in contact with the hospital communications office. They're running a follow-up segment tonight. A brief pause. "They've asked if you'll comment." "No," Cassandra said. "That was fast." "I don't need a news segment," she said. "I need a nursing license and a trauma bay. Those are both still intact." Silva was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said, "you handled this the right way." "I handled it the way I had to," Cassandra said, which was more accurate. She ended the call and finished the bad coffee and went back to work. At 3:47 p.m., the nursing board sent a formal communication to Mercy Crest's legal office. Cassandra read it in Karen's office, with Karen present, an hour after it arrived. The language was procedural and specific. The emergency petition filed by Dr. Warren Felt had been accepted for intake review, but had been flagged for preliminary examination of petitioner standing in light of newly submitted documentation. The board's standard review of the original scope of practice incident would proceed on its normal timeline. The emergency acceleration request was denied, which meant Felt's attempt to move fast had stalled. The board would still look at what she'd done in the trauma bay. That was appropriate, she thought. That was what the board was for. But it would look at it in the ordinary way without the pressure of the accelerated timeline Felt had designed, and it would look at it alongside a corrected military record and a Silver Star citation and a Surgeon General's office policy comment and the documented history of the man who'd filed the petition. Karen set the communication down. She looked at Cassandra with the expression of someone who has arrived at the end of a very long day before the actual day has ended. "How are you doing?" she said. "Tired," Cassandra said, which was the honest answer and took less energy than any of the fuller ones. "Go home," Karen said. "Come back tonight. Trauma's yours." Cassandra went to the 4th floor first. Marcus Hale had been moved out of the ICU at 2 p.m., still serious, still carefully monitored, but no longer requiring the level of continuous attention that the ICU provided. He was in a private room at the end of the East Corridor, and when Cassandra pushed the door open, he was awake, which was more awake than she'd expected. Not upright. He was propped at maybe 30 degrees, which was the correct position for where he was post-operatively, and he was pale in the specific deep way of someone who has lost a significant amount of blood and had it partially replaced. His father was in the chair beside the bed, jacket off again, in the position of someone who had not moved very much in the last several hours. Marcus Hale looked at her when she came in. His eyes were more focused than they'd been at 4 in the morning. He was tracking clearly. Soldiers recovered with a particular efficiency that she'd observed many times and still found striking. Not faster than civilians in the clinical sense, but with a more deliberate relationship to the process, as if the body understood that recovery was also a mission and had allocated resources accordingly. "You're the nurse," he said. "I'm a nurse," she said, coming to the bedside. "There are several of us." "Dad said you're the one who—" He stopped. His face moved through something that was working to be controlled and wasn't quite. "Who kept me here?" "Your surgeon kept you here," she said. "Dr. Faraday. You should thank him." Dad said before Faraday. She checked his chart. His vitals were holding where they should be. "How's your pain level?" 6, he said. "Maybe 7. It's fine." "It's not fine. It's expected." She made a note. "I'm going to have the on-shift nurse adjust your pain management before I leave. Don't be stoic about it. Stoic about pain post-op slows healing." He looked at her. 29, with his father's jaw and something around the eyes that was different. More open, she thought, or less armored. Or maybe just currently stripped of the armor by blood loss and morphine and the specific vulnerability of having almost not survived. "My dad told me about the letter," he said. "About what you carried." She glanced at Bowen Hale. He was watching his son, not her. She looked back at the chart. "That's between your father and me," she said. "He said he spent years being wrong about you." "He had reasons," she said. "They were wrong reasons, but they were reasons." She set the chart back. "People are more complicated than the stories we tell about them. That goes for everyone in that particular history, including me." Marcus looked at her for a moment with the directness of someone who has recently been close enough to the end of things to not have patience for the indirect. "Why didn't you use the letter earlier?" he said. "If it would have—" "Because Raymond Voss asked me to use my judgment," she said. "For a long time my judgment said the people who needed protecting still needed protecting. Then it changed." He absorbed that. Slowly, the way you absorb things when your system is running at reduced capacity and is using its resources for more urgent functions. "Colonel Voss," he said. "Did you know him well?" 8 months, she said. "Well enough. Was he—" He stopped. Reconsidered. "Was he good?" She thought about Raymond Voss. The specific weight of that question, asked by a young soldier who had come close enough to dying that he was perhaps measuring the people who'd shaped the world he'd returned to. "He was human," she said. "He made an impossible choice well, and he made sure the right people survived it." She picked up her bag. "That's about as good as any of us get to be." She said goodbye and left the room before either of them could say anything that would require more from her than she had left to give right now. In the corridor, she stopped. She put her back against the wall beside the door and stood there for a moment. Not long. 30 seconds, maybe. Long enough for the corridor to be just a corridor, with its linoleum and its overhead lights and its distant cart noise and its ordinary ongoing life. She had been awake for, she counted backward, approximately 31 hours. She had guided a man's son back from the edge of something irreversible. She had sat in the family lounge in the dark early morning and put a piece of paper across a table that she'd been carrying for 6 years. She had walked into an administrative meeting that was designed to end her professionally and walked out of it with her job intact and the machinery of something larger in motion. None of it had been neat. None of it had felt, while it was happening, like the version of itself that you could stand back from and see the shape of. It had felt like the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the thing after that, each one arrived at before the previous one was fully resolved. That was how it always was. She'd noticed that over the years. People expected that justice, when it came, would feel different from the rest. More distinct, more finished, and maybe it did, eventually, but in the immediate hours of it, it mostly felt like more work. She picked up her bag and went home. She slept for 7 hours, which was 4 hours more than her usual post-shift sleep, and woke up at 10 p.m. feeling the specific way you felt after the body has finally been given what it needed and has taken it seriously. She showered, made food she actually sat down to eat, and drove to the hospital for the 11 p.m. shift. The trauma floor at 11 p.m. was in its night configuration. Lower staff, steadier pacing, the particular quality of attention required by the hours between midnight and 4, when the human body was at its most vulnerable and the most important things happened in the quietest rooms. She knew this shift the way she knew the elevator timing. Years of accumulated pattern, filed under reliable. She pulled the first chart from the rack, checked the bay assignments, said hello to the 2 nurses coming off the prior shift and the resident who was staying over and had the particular expression of someone who would be a good doctor in 4 years and was currently getting there the hard way. She worked. At 2 a.m., a trauma came in. A car accident on the 287, one driver, chest and arm injuries, conscious and frightened in the way of people who understand they are hurt, but not how badly. She ran the assessment, managed the pain, coordinated with the on-call surgeon, talked to the patient's wife who arrived 12 minutes later with car keys still in her hand and terror in her face. The patient's injuries were significant but survivable. By 4 a.m., he was in surgery and the wife was in the waiting area with coffee. Cassandra had asked a nursing aide to bring her. She worked. At 6:30 a.m., Karen Mott appeared at the nurses' station, which was unusual at that hour. She was in her civilian clothes, which meant she had come in specifically rather than stayed over, which meant something had happened. She set a piece of paper on the desk in front of Cassandra. The board called at 6, Karen said. They expedited the preliminary review. Not Felt's timeline, their own, because the petition circumstances required it. They wanted the standing question resolved before the standard review proceeds. She tapped the paper. Read it. Cassandra read it. The nursing board's preliminary finding was formal and specific. The petition filed by Warren Felt had been examined for petitioner standing. Given the documented undisclosed censure, the documented pattern of retaliatory filings, and the factual inaccuracies contained within the petition itself, the board found that the petition lacked the credibility threshold required for emergency consideration. It had been dismissed. The standard review of the original scope incident would proceed on a 60-day timeline, during which Ms. Holt's license remained in full standing. She read it twice. She set it down. Karen was watching her. The standard review, Cassandra said. Will go the way it goes, Karen said, but you have the Surgeon General's policy comment, the corrected record, the clinical documentation from Faraday. You have a good case. She paused. I think you know that. What happened to Felt? Cassandra said. Karen sat on the edge of the neighboring desk. It was the most casual she'd seen Karen be in 7 years, and she thought it might be the result of early morning and significant events, and the particular loosening that happened when the worst thing you'd been bracing for had resolved. He was placed on administrative leave yesterday afternoon pending the credentialing review, Karen said. The committee is meeting Friday. Given what the inquiry found, and given that Harrington has retained personal counsel and is not in a position to run interference for anyone right now, I expect Felt's employment here will not survive that meeting. Harrington, Cassandra said. He submitted his written account of the credentialing committee meeting 4 years ago, Karen said. He maintains that the censure was reviewed and deemed insufficiently severe to warrant disclosure notation. She looked at Cassandra steadily. Hospital Legal disagrees with that characterization of the policy. They are discussing whether his account constitutes a misrepresentation. She paused. His position as CMO is, at minimum, under significant strain. Cassandra absorbed that. She thought about Ellis Harrington in the conference room, looking at her service record. She thought about the specific architecture of the thing he'd built with Felt, whether deliberately or through the accumulated weight of compatible assumptions, the way an institution could become the shape of its most powerful people's blind spots without anyone explicitly designing it that way. She didn't think Harrington was a bad man in the simple sense. She thought he was a man who had made choices that were convenient for him and harmful to others, and had never been seriously asked to account for them until the morning when everything converged. That morning had now happened. The accounting was underway. The night news segment aired, Karen said. Channel 9. 30 seconds on Felt's credentialing situation, 10 seconds noting that his original petition had been dismissed. She looked at something on her phone. They did not name you by name in the follow-up. They named him. Cassandra nodded once. Also, Karen said, the Surgeon General's office confirmed this morning that the policy comment they submitted to the board will be formally published as a guidance document in January. Scope of practice for advanced trained RNs in trauma emergencies with no physician of record. It's not binding, but it's the kind of guidance that becomes binding within 2 to 3 years. Cassandra looked at the chart in front of her, at the patient's name and the numbers that represented the current state of a living person, and thought about what Karen had just said. A guidance document, January. The kind of thing that would change, incrementally and then not so incrementally, what the next version of the night she'd had would look like for the nurse standing where she'd been standing. Not dramatic, not a ceremony. A document that would sit in a policy file until it didn't need to anymore, because it had become the standard. She picked up her pen. I have 2 more hours on shift, she said. Karen stood. I'll let you work. She was almost at the end of the station when Cassandra said, Karen. Karen looked back. Thank you for pulling the file, Cassandra said. Yesterday morning, when I called, you didn't have to move that fast. Karen looked at her for a moment. You've been in my department for 7 years, she said. You saved a man's life 3 times in 18 hours. The least I could do was make a phone call. She left. Cassandra wrote for a few minutes. Then she set down the pen and sat for a moment in the quiet of the station, in the particular way she sometimes sat, not resting, not thinking exactly, just occupying the moment without pushing it in any direction. She thought about a thing she'd understood for years, but had not always felt the truth of. That the people who try to erase you are counting on the fact that being erased is easier than standing in the space they've left you with nothing to hold on to. That the silence they impose is supposed to feel like your own silence, like something you've accepted. That the paperwork of diminishment, accumulated over years, is designed to look inevitable. She had not accepted it. She had carried what she'd been given to carry, and she had done the work in front of her, and she had not, on any of the mornings when it would have been easier, decided that the erasure was the truth. That was not a heroic thing. She didn't think of it as heroic. It was just the choice she'd made, repeatedly, without drama, in the small increments of ordinary days. Put on the scrubs, go to the patient, do the work, know what you know. The work was the thing. It had always been the thing, not the recognition, that came and went and could be taken, as she'd learned, and could also be returned, as she'd also learned. The work stayed. The work was the part that was actually hers. 6 weeks later, Cassandra was in the break room when her phone buzzed with an unknown number, and she answered it mostly out of habit. Ms. Holt, a young male voice, rougher than it would eventually be, still recovering. It's Marcus Hale. She set down her coffee. Captain, how are you? Walking, he said. Slowly. Physical therapy is... A brief pause. Challenging. That's the correct word for it, she said. A silence. I wanted to call, he said, and then stopped, which told her he had decided to call, but had not fully decided what to say when the call connected. She recognized that. She'd made calls like that. You don't need to say anything specific, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to anyway. Another pause. My dad told me the whole story, the letter, the inquiry, all of it. He told me what it cost you. Your dad is settling a debt he feels he owes, she said. Let him. That's... yeah. Something in his voice that was almost a laugh but had too much else in it. He's not great at owing things. He's learning, she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Is it strange, he said, to have gotten it back, the record, the recognition, after this long? She thought about that seriously, because he was asking seriously, about what it felt like, about the inside of it. It's strange, she said, not bad strange, more like finding something you stopped actively looking for. You'd reorganized around not having it, and then it's there and the reorganizing doesn't undo itself immediately. Does it undo itself eventually? She looked at the break room wall. The Crooked Mountain photograph was still crooked. She'd straightened it twice, and someone always put it back. She'd stopped straightening it. I'll tell you when I know, she said. He made a sound that was more of a laugh that time, less weight in it. Fair enough. Finish your PT, she said. Don't be stoic. We covered this in the hospital. I remember, he said. You were very direct about it. I'm very direct about most things. Yeah, he said, and she could hear that he meant it as something more than agreement. I noticed. They ended the call with the specific brevity of people who have communicated what they needed to and don't need to extend it. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, and then she put it in her pocket and finished her coffee and walked back to the trauma floor. The board issued its final determination on a Thursday in December, 48 days after the incident. The language was formal, and she read it at the nurse's station during a quiet moment between patients, which was the right way to receive it. Not in a ceremony, not in an office, just at her desk, in her scrubs, with the day continuing around her. The finding was no violation. The board cited the emergency clinical necessity exception, the absence of physician coverage, the patient's documented critical trajectory, and the Surgeon General's guidance document, pre-publication, submitted as a comment, but sufficient for the board's purposes. It noted, in a section that she read twice, that the distinction between directional assistance and unauthorized independent practice was meaningful and that the evidence in this case supported the former characterization. It noted that the petition that had precipitated the timeline had been dismissed. It noted that her license was in full standing. She folded the determination and put it in her left breast pocket, zipped, and went back to the chart she'd been working on. Karen Mott came by at 3 p.m. and said, without preamble, "I read it." "I know you did," Cassandra said. "How do you feel?" She considered the honest answer, which was complicated in the way that honest answers about significant things usually were. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly. Relief implied that she'd been afraid. And she hadn't been afraid, she'd been working. More like the specific settling that happened when something you'd been holding at tension finally resolved to its actual shape. "Like I have a full shift to finish," she said. Karen smiled, a real one, not the professional version. "That's the right answer." 2 days later, a transfer request landed in Karen's office. An application from a trauma nurse in Denver who had heard about the guidance document and the case that preceded it and wanted to work in the department where it had happened. He was 34, former Air Force medic, strong trauma background. Karen showed it to Cassandra as a matter of professional courtesy. Cassandra read the application. She thought about the guidance document, about January, when it would be published, about the departments that would read it, and the nurses who would stand in trauma bays with its language behind them in a way that hadn't existed before this December. "Interview him," she said. She gave the application back and went to the next patient, and the one after that, and the one after that, because the work was the thing, and the work didn't pause for its own significance, and neither, in the end, did she. She was 41 years old. She had carried a letter for 6 years and set it down at the right time. She had been dismissed and documented and publicly named as a risk, and she had stood in the specific space that created and not moved from it. Not because she was extraordinary, she knew her own flaws too well to accept that word without modification, but because she understood, in the way you understand things that have been tested by actual weight rather than just considered, that the version of you that other people try to reduce you to is only true if you accept the reduction. She hadn't. She picked up the next chart. Outside the trauma wing windows, Dunmore, Wyoming, moved through its December in the ordinary way, cold, functional, indifferent to the specific significance of what had happened inside one of its buildings over the last 6 weeks. The fog had long since lifted. The sky on this particular Thursday afternoon was the clear, pale blue of high-altitude winter, the kind of blue that had no ambiguity in it, the kind that simply was what it was. Cassandra Holt clipped the chart to the board, straightened her stethoscope, and answered the next call.